21st, 1997. I'm in the presence of Doug Horn from the Review Board. My name is Jeremy Gunn, and we are interviewing today Dr. Robert Grossman at his offices in Houston, Texas. Dr. Grossman, could you describe for me very briefly your background in medicine prior to November 22nd, 1963?
Yes. I was born and grew up in New York City and went to college at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and graduated in 1953. I then went to medical school at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, Columbia University in New York City, and finished medical school in 1957. Then I took a year of surgical internship at the Strong Memorial Hospital at the University of Rochester. Then I did my military service. I was in the U.S. Army, and I was assigned to Walter Reed Hospital, to the Army Institute of Research, where I did basic scientific research for 2 years. In 1960, I started my neurosurgery training back at Columbia at the Neurological Institute in New York City. I'd gotten credit for my time in the Army as counting toward my residency because of the nature of the work I had done. So I finished my residency in 1963, and then I joined Dr. Kemp Clark at Southwestern Medical School in Dallas in 1963. So I had arrived in Dallas that summer with my wife and 2 little children in July of 1963.
You started working at Parkland in July of 1963?
Yes.
And what was your position officially there?
I was assistant professor of neurosurgery. I may at that point have been instructor. I think actually I was appointed as an instructor in neurosurgery. And there were only 2 of us in the department, Dr. Clark, who was the chief of the department, and myself. And a residency training program had just been started. That year we had our first resident.
Could you tell me where you were when you first heard that President Kennedy had been shot?
Yes, naturally these memories are very vivid, and I'm sure like most people who are involved will always be with us. I remember extremely clearly. I was sitting in my laboratory, which was in the main medical school building, which was across the parking lot from Parkland Hospital. And Dr. Clark and I were both in the laboratory. We were just chatting in general because the lab was right across from our offices. And we received a telephone call. Dr. Clark answered, and he told me that he had heard the president was shot. And this was about 11 o'clock in the morning. I can't remember the exact time. And we looked at each other and said, well, someone's just playing a joke on us, and this is just a bad joke. We looked at each other and said, well, maybe we better go walk over to the hospital and take a look. So we walked across, we went down the elevator, we walked across the parking lot, and when we were about halfway across the parking lot, we saw the cars, the motorcade cars, a car that had brought him, so we started running. And we ran across the parking lot into the hospital, and we went to the trauma room where we saw the president.
About how far from the lab was the trauma room, or the main part of the hospital?
We had to go down several floors on the elevator, and the parking lot was probably 100 yards across distance from the entrance to the emergency room.
When you first saw the vehicles from the motorcade, were there any people in the vehicles? That is, were they still arriving, or had people that left the cars?
The president had left the car.
And once you went into the hospital, you went directly to the trauma room on the first floor?
We did.
When you went into the trauma room, approximately how many people were in the room at that time?
probably were 7 or 8 people. Mrs. Kennedy was in a corner of the room. I remember her. She had a white dress on. She had blood and brain material on her dress. I believe Jim Carrico was there, now the current chairman. I think Malcolm Perry, the vascular surgeon, was there. I don't remember the other people.
When you walked into the room, was President Kennedy's head towards the door, or were his feet? What was the closest part?
I think his feet were toward the door, and he was lying on the stretcher, and I don't believe at that point anyone recognized that he had a head wound, because he had had a tracheostomy done. That was the first order of business. But I'm pretty certain that until Dr. Clark and I picked his head up, that no one recognized that he had a head wound.
What were the circumstances, or could you describe how you lifted his head up?
As I remember it, Dr. Clark was on one side. I think he probably was on the president's left side, and I was on the right side. I think I remember we picked his head up together and looked at his head, and you could see that there was an entry wound in the occipital bone over the cerebellum, and you could see blood and tissue coming out of that wound. And then he had very long or thick hair, not necessarily long, but thick hair, and you could see blood in the parietal area. When we parted the hair, looked at it more carefully, you could see that his parietal bone had been broken, and what we would call in the operating room a bone flap, or a slab of bone, had been lifted up. It was clearly was an exit type of wound, and there was brain tissue visible underneath.
I'd like to use some non-medical terms, if I could, just to see if it can help us out. What I'd like to do is just assume that the president's standing up, and that there's a plane that intersects his ear going vertical up and down, and refer to the part behind the ear as the back and in front of the ear as the front. When you refer to the occipital area, was the wound entirely behind the ear, or did any of it extend towards the front?
The entry wound was behind the ear, and it was pretty close to the middle of the head. Pretty close to the
midline?
Pretty close to the midline, and above the top of the spine, so that if you would put your hand on the back of your head in the midline at about the level of the ear, that's where it would be.
Okay, now as you're saying this, you're putting your hand to the back of your head and touching it, from what I can observe, as completely behind the ear,
yes,
just above the neck.
Yes.
And that was principally in the occipital area?
That's what we would call the occipital area.
Okay. What I'd like to do is ask you, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to show you some diagrams from Grant's anatomy, and ask if you might be willing to circle the area of approximately where the wound was. I have let me just start with 3 diagrams that are from Grant's anatomy. The first one shows an anterior view of a skull, which may not have any injuries from the way that you've described it. But if there were any injuries visible on Exhibit 1, I'd appreciate it if you mark those. Then Exhibit 2, which shows a right lateral view, and the third is a posterior view.
Okay, well, as I recall the entry wound, it was in this area over here.
Okay, and you're making a circle on the third diagram, is that correct?
Yes, that's right, yeah, right. And why do I say it's an entry wound? Because it's smaller than the other wound, and it did not have the characteristic of an exit wound where tissue is usually exploded outward.
You've drawn an E in the middle on
entry.
Meaning entry on diagram 3.
That's my interpretation. I mean, as I recall quite clearly, this is where this wound was, but I should say, when I say entry, that's my interpretation of what an entry wound looks like, as we saw many bullet wounds in the head, and then what I would interpret as the exit wound was here.
And you're now drawing on diagram number 2.
That is correct. Yes.
And the circle that you're making on diagram 2 is
a plate
3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times larger than the one on diagram 3.
That's correct. It was a plate of bone which appeared to be lifted out or separated from the skull.
Now, could you tell me the diagram or the drawing that you've made on Exhibit 2, this was a flap in some way, is that correct?
In the sense that the bone itself was lifted outward. It appeared to, something from the inside appeared to have pushed it outward.
Now, how was it that you observed that? Is that by pulling the hair back, or was there a flap that came down?
No, just by pulling the hair back and inspecting his head.
Okay. Approximately how much time were you able to spend observing the wounds that you've just described?
I think we could see this all very clearly in less than a minute. It really wasn't necessary to look at it longer. I think we were probably in the trauma room with him 15 to 30 minutes. It's very difficult to say how long we were there, but there was ample time to view this clearly and to understand what you would also have to do surgically if the patient were survivable or could be taken to the operating. We're accustomed to seeing gunshot wounds to the head and making decisions quickly as to how they should be treated.
Can you tell me approximately how many gunshot wound cases that you had participated in your medical training to that point?
To that point, not many, because at Columbia we did not see many gunshot wounds. After that, at Parkland, of course, I saw a very great number. It would be difficult to know exactly. Probably at least 50 a year for the 7 years I was there. And since then, of course, I've seen many wounds also.
When you saw the wounds, can you tell me both in the wound that you've drawn on, first with the wound that you've drawn on diagram 3, was the scalp missing from that wound, or was the wound covered by hair? Do you recall?
It was covered by hair. There was an entry wound. You could see that something had penetrated, so it had moved the hair aside or pushed the hair aside. But you wouldn't really describe this as an area that was shaved or where the hair was missing in a large area, nor would you describe it as a piece of scalp being cut out or missing. It was just a puncture in the scalp.
Were you able to see any brain tissue through the wound?
Back there, yes, you could see brain tissue.
Were you able to identify the part of the brain that was visible?
Well, my impression was that it was the cerebellum, but again, I don't think you could be certain about that.
I'd like to show you a diagram. This is not from Grant's anatomy, and just ask whether it's possible on that diagram, which is marked as Exhibit 4, whether you would be able to mark the portion of the brain where the wound was.
This was my impression that the wound had the bullet had gone in here and exited in the parietal area, so that it had gone into the cerebellum and come up through what we would call the tentorium, which is this leaf of covering the dura that separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobe. My impression was that the bullet had taken that trajectory. I couldn't see that trajectory, but just from the knowledge of the anatomy, if the bullet entered here and came out here, that would have to be the course it took.
And on the diagram, just I'll say it for the record, you've drawn a dotted line with an arrow pointing upwards with it, appearing as though the entrance is in the cerebellum and exiting up in the parietal area.
Correct.
During the time that you made the observations of the wound, did you see any bullets or bullet fragments at all?
No.
I believe that you said earlier that you were in the room, in trauma room number 1, for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Is that?
That's my impression.
After you lifted the president's head up and identified the wound, what else did you do in trauma room 1?
Well, after we did that, and I think what we did at that point, I think, may have very transiently stopped the other physicians who were trying to get an EKG taken so we could see if there was any heart activity, and also trying to resuscitate the president with cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So that's why we didn't take very long to do this portion, but we put his head down, and then they were still trying to, as I recall, attach the EKG leads and giving medications and seeing if they could get his heart started. I was never certain in my own mind whether or not the president had made any agonal gasps or was still attempting to make some sort of agonal respirations or not. And I was never certain whether anyone had detected any cardiac activity. My impression was that it was never possible to detect any cardiac activity electrically or by means of the pulse. So there might possibly have been some agonal type of gasping.
The approximate timings were that President Kennedy was shot at about 12:30 p.m. and he was pronounced dead at approximately 1 p.m. Was it your impression at the time that you were treating him in trauma room number 1 that he was still alive throughout that period, though obviously in a very weakened state?
I could never be certain whether he would be termed alive. In those days, the definition of life was a heartbeat, or some respiration. In other words, the heartbeat might be so weak that you couldn't detect it by pulse. If you couldn't get the EKG electrodes on in the right place with a lot of interference going on, you might not be able to pick up an EKG. So that it's possible he may have been alive, according to the technical definition of some heartbeat or some respiration, but I was never certain whether he was or wasn't.
Was it your impression after looking at the wound that it was obviously an immediately fatal wound and there was nothing that could be done to revive him?
Well, no, we do see very bad wounds. I've had patients with wounds like that have entered there and exited the private area. Some of them have had amazingly, comparatively little long-term sequelae, but the difference was, or is, between the president's case and the cases we generally see. But the wounds I'm talking about that are survivable are pistol wounds, where the energy delivered by the bullet is much less. So I would say if you looked at the wound itself, it wouldn't necessarily be fatal, although obviously there could be tremendous intellectual damage, neurological damage. But if you know in conjunction, which we did not know at that point, but if you know in conjunction it was a high-power rifle bullet, then you would say you would be not surviving. But at that point we didn't know what had happened.
Did you observe any other activities for the treatment of President Kennedy beyond what you've described?
No.
So far?
The group of people tried to do CPR, tried to get an EKG, but it was obvious, I thought, after about 20 minutes that there was no activity and we couldn't establish any cardiac activity. And that Dr. Clark, who is the most senior person there, and everyone was very young. I was 30 years old. I think Dr. Clark was probably 35 or 36 years old. I think he was the oldest person there. Everyone was very young faculty. it sort of fell to him, it's my impression, to pronounce the president dead as a senior individual, and also comforted Mrs. Kennedy. Try to comfort her.
I'd like to make sure that my understanding from something that you said earlier is correct. When you arrived in the room, had a tracheostomy already been performed?
That was my impression, that it had already been performed.
Okay. And when you arrived in the room, had President's shirt been removed? Do you recall?
Can't recall that.
When did you leave the room in terms of the sequence of events?
I think after Dr. Clark pronounced him dead and was comforting Mrs. Kennedy.
Did you go back into the trauma room 1 after the first time that you departed?
I'm pretty sure I did not go back into the room.
So you left then, is it correct, shortly after that he had been pronounced dead?
Yeah. Yes.
So you were not present when there was any cleaning of the body or wrapping or anything of that sort?
No.
Did you see President Kennedy put into a coffin?
No. I did see him wheel down the hall, so all of that must have taken place rather quickly. I did see him wheeled down the hall, and the medical examiner tried to stop the Secret Service man from taking the body. I can't remember his name. It might have been Rose.
Earl Rose.
And he tried to stop them, and I think legally he was correct, because technically he should have been able to, hold the body and examine it. The Secret Service were absolutely furious because they had failed in their mission. They were so angry they picked him up, and I think they punched him. And they knocked him down, as I recall. At least they pushed him rather roughly to one side and just wheeled the body out. And that was the end of his attempt to stop the proceedings.
So then, after you were out of trauma room 1, you saw the body being wheeled down the hallway of the hospital?
At the exit.
And that's before the body was put in a coffin?
I don't know, because the body was covered. I suspect that the body probably was not in a coffin. I don't know how they could have gotten a coffin much quickly. I suspect the body was just covered with the wrapping.
Okay. Do you know where the body was taken to? I mean, you say probably not in the coffin. Where?
No, I don't know. After I assumed that the body came from trauma room 1 and had not been cleaned or prepared in any way, but again, I don't know that. As I say, I left the room, and my impression was that the time seemed to have been fairly short between the time that I left and the time I saw them taking the body, and my impression would be that they would have had a difficult time taking the body individually.
I'm sure that one can't assume that standard procedures were followed on this day. But if a patient would typically, if a patient dies died in the trauma room, where would the body be taken immediately after the death?
Be taken to the morgue.
In the hospital.
In the hospital.
I presume that one wouldn't want caskets brought in the hospital for psychology of patients, or at least in public areas. Was there a place in the hospital where a body would typically be put into a casket?
I don't know. I don't recall where the morgue was in the hospital. And I really don't know if there was a place in which I suspect that probably the undertakers would bring a casket and they would bring it down to the morgue area, and the person would be put into that casket and taken.
Did you have any other direct experience yourself related to the body of President Kennedy?
No further experience.
Did any government official interview you within a few days after the assassination?
No.
So FBI, state troopers?
No.
Did anyone from the Warren Commission speak to you?
No.
Did anyone from the House Select Committee on Assassinations speak to you?
No.
Does that mean that today here we are the first government officials to have sat down with you and interviewed you about your experiences?
Yes.
After President Kennedy left the hospital, did you attend the press briefing that Dr. Perry gave in the hospital?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever hear of any government officials, such as from the FBI or Secret Service, coming to the hospital at any point after the death of the president to talk to doctors?
As I recall, Dr. Clark went to Washington and talked to perhaps the Warren Commission or some individuals in Washington. I don't recall if anyone came to talk to him. I felt that we were both there together. We worked very closely, had full confidence in Dr. Clark, and I thought that, he should be the spokesman for what happened from the neurosurgical viewpoint. I think that I really did not want any publicity attached to myself with relationship to this, which is why I didn't make any effort to push myself forward. It was obvious to me that there would be many cranks and strange individuals with an interest in this. And in fact, Dr. Clark, for many years, would get two types of letters or calls. One type saying, "You killed the president, good for you," or "You failed to save the president, we're going to get you." So, it was obvious that this entire episode tended to bring out the worst in many individuals. And I had young children, and I really didn't want anyone bothering my family.
We've spoken about the wounds on the head of the president, and just so I can make sure, there are no other wounds that you noticed on the head other than the two that you've drawn on diagrams numbers 2 and 3. Is that correct?
I didn't see any other wounds.
And we talked about the wound on the throat, but there had been a tracheostomy where you had seen the tracheostomy. Did you see any other wounds on President Kennedy's body?
No.
Back?
I didn't.
Okay. Over the years, many people have been interested in issues related to the Kennedy assassination. Have you ever spoken with anyone about this issue? So now not government officials, but other researchers about the assassination?
I recall that perhaps 10 years ago, a reporter from a Boston newspaper called and wanted to talk with me, and I may have told him what I've told you, but I can't recall if I did or not.
Okay.
But that's the only other person I've ever talked to about this, with the exception of my family and friends.
Dr. Grossman, is there any other issue or event or knowledge that you have for issues related to the assassination that you think would be important to have on the record?
No, there really isn't. It was obviously a very terrible time. None of us knew what was happening. I think the general feeling was this might have been a prelude to World War III. The president had just faced down Russians over Cuba, and there certainly was a great deal of political tension. And I think many people had the feeling that perhaps in some way the Russians had assassinated him and a war would start. I think that might be the center of a cyclone and wondering exactly what was going to happen. But beyond the general feeling of everybody at the time, I had nothing more to contribute to this. It's the subject of a great deal of speculation. Many physicians, like Dr. Latimer, one of my old teachers, got very absorbed in this. I think those who were there may not have been quite so eager to be morbid about this as other people have been.
Let me try a couple of last questions. Are you able to give any measurements on the size of the wounds in centimeters or inches? Is that?
Yes, this is good. My impression was the occipital opening was about 2 centimeters, and the parietal area lifted bone was about 6 centimeters.
Those are roughly 6 centimeters and 2 centimeters in diameter.
Yes.
And the last question I have for you is whether you took any notes contemporaneously or wrote anything down shortly after the assassination about your experience or any contemporary description
No,
of what happened.
I didn't. And looking back on it, it may seem strange that I did have been such an historic event, but as a matter of fact, I simply didn't.
Do you know any of the doctors who treated President Kennedy who did take notes immediately afterwards or write something down? Did you ever hear about that?
I don't know. I mean, I knew Jim Carrico and Malcolm Perry very well, but I never knew if anyone ever did anything. In retrospect, probably would have been a good idea to make drawings. But at the time, we were all so horrified that I think that we really didn't want to have anything more to do with it. We lived through a whole bad sequence of deaths because shortly after that, Oswald was shot, and the same group of doctors took care of him, and I examined him when he came in. And of course, Jack Ruby was in the hospital, but did not see him with cancer. So there was a whole series of horrible events that really didn't dwell on them.
I assume from what you've said so far that you had nothing to do with the treatment of Governor Connolly. Is that right?
That's correct. In fact, I never even saw him. He was in a room across the hall from the trauma room, and he seemed to be well taken care of, so that I didn't go in. Other people didn't go unless he directly went to his chest wound.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate talking with you.
Very good. Thanks.